Inuites and friends. When Janaki started introducing me, she said, it's a very tough act to follow, Kanhaiya. You'll agree that I have two very tough acts to follow, because indeed, Janaki's has been one of the luminous presences here. I have followed all these debates over the last few days, and also over the last few years, in fact. And I think that one of the things that makes us special or important to the nation is precisely this alternative performative, this platform, the stage on which we actually can demonstrate our ideas, our disagreements, how to think clearly, in fact, rather than the other performative, which is, I would say, mesmerizing. When Kanhaiya came out of jail and gave this talk, I was a convert. I was also swaying and dancing around with everyone. It was a great moment. But what I'm going to do today is actually to emphasize this other performative, where we talk about ideas, we are objective, we are critical, we don't get carried away, we are open-minded, we are able to interrogate and critique ourselves, and not just mount attacks on people we disagree with. And indeed, also check factually incorrect statements, the sources of our ideas and so forth. And I do hope that there's an occasion to discuss some of these things later if there is time for a question and answer. But let me go straight to my topic, which Janaki read correctly except one little bit, so I'll repeat the topic. India's uncivil wars, Tagore, Gandhi. There was an ellipsis, ... JNU and what's left of the nation. So it's a little bit of a complicated topic, but I'll just say very simply that JNU is at the center of these two sides of the debates. I've got on one side, so to speak, Tagore, Gandhi. On the other side, there is India's what's left of the nation, and in between is JNU. So let me start without further ado with Tagore and Gandhi, and then maybe come to what's left of the nation, and if there's time, maybe also reflect a bit on JNU, if that's okay with you. Is that all right? Oh, can you hear me all? All of you can hear me at the back? All right, thank you, Nivedita, thank you. Anyhow, so I want to start with an epigraph, and the epigraph is from John, who was also called Jack Gallagher, who was a late professor of imperial history, first at Oxford, then at Cambridge, and he said, "Revolutions devour their children, nationalism eats its parents." I'll repeat that. Revolutions devour their children. Nationalism eats its parents. And you know, of course, that the first part of this quotation, revolutions devour their children, goes back to Jacques Mallet Dupin, 1793, his quip after the French Revolution, or during the French Revolution, when he said, revolution devours its children. Now, I suppose most of us here would neither like to devour our children, right, or consume our parents. And what is it that we should be doing, What kind of space is there between our so-called revolutionaries and our so-called ultra-nationalists? That is what I wanted to explore today. And I'm a student of literature. I'm deeply interested in how texts are read and interpreted. And texts include so many things, including these slogans, including, a very beautiful, as it were, demonstration out here. There's an aesthetics of this, as we've seen, Janaki also mentioned. So I'm deeply interested in questions of hermeneutics and interpretation. And I would like to suggest, for your consideration today, a certain kind of hermeneutics of mediality. And it's interesting that the word medium, medium, all of these words go back to very old roots where they merge with, words like madhyam. And those of you who are interested in classical Indian thought, there's a very famous school, actually, of Buddhism, which is called Madhyamak. So how to mediate, what kind of hermeneutics can we have of mediation, a medial hermeneutics. And perhaps to begin with, this has to be an intermedial hermeneutics, where you find a way to negotiate or stand between two opposites or two poles to see, how these two sides, how these two positions can speak to one another. But perhaps if this project of mediality really succeeds, then from being intermedial, it might actually end up being remedial. And the idea of the remedy is really connected with what we consider our state of health. Our state of health, in many ways, is about restoring equilibrium, really. And of course, that's very difficult to do in these times. But this is the hermeneutics that I wish to propose today. And may I, if you allow me, to also mention that there is an equivalence of this in contemporary thinking, and that is called a diatopical hermeneutics. And let me just quote you a very small excerpt from a person who uses this. He's a Portuguese comparatist and scholar and social scientist. His name is Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and I'll quote. So he says, what is diatopical hermeneutics? It is placing oneself simultaneously inside and outside what one critiques, and thus making possible what he calls the doubly transgressive sociology of absences and emergences. Here's a kind of further explanation, because it's theoretically possibly a bit dense, especially in an occasion like this, where it's much easier to relate to very reductive formulations, right? Where you know who the enemy is, who the friend is, and you can pit one against the other. But obviously, when we are conducting a different kind of discourse, we have to open our minds. So here's what he says. Diatopical hermeneutics is based on the idea that the topoi of an individual culture, this could be an individual ideology, no matter how strong they are as incomplete as that culture or ideology itself. Such incompleteness is not visible from inside the culture itself, since aspiration to totality induces taking a particular position in toto. The objective of diatopical hermeneutics is therefore not to achieve completeness, that being an unachievable goal, but on the contrary, to raise the consciousness of reciprocal incompleteness to its possible maximum by engaging in the dialogue, as it were, with one foot in one topos and the other in the other, right? So please understand where this is coming from. This is coming from the admission that no topoi, no ideology is complete in itself. So it's only when we accept that there are some difficulties, some problems, some absences perhaps, some reductive misunderstandings or factual errors in our own position that we can engage in this kind of diatopical understanding or dialogue. And fundamentally, I think that the challenge of mediality today is to have non-reductive understandings of not just Tagore and Gandhi, but actually of issues such as nationalism itself. Okay, now, let me now go straight to the people, to the figures I'm talking about. And if a friend here can hold up the first book a bit, this one, the other one. Yeah, just hold it up for a second. What I tried to do in this book is really to talk about that middle ground that we want to retrieve today. The middle ground of how India was made, the consensus that made modern India possible. And we can later talk about what happens to that consensus post-independence and so forth. But let's look a bit at Tagore's idea of nationalism. I want to focus on, I mean, whenever you get bored with my talking, you can look at these dogs. They are enacting their own joyous celebration of our performance here. And I'm reminded of occasions when, in JNU, as you know, attendance is not required. And, with very large classes also, sometimes I had only 3-4 people. But there used to be a dog who always came to my class. So I said to my 2 or 3 students, "Arey koi to sunne aa raha hai, you know? As long as there's even one person, main to apni baat bolunga." Anyhow, so let them be, let them frolic, you know, since possibly they don't know what we're going through. But anyhow, so I want to focus on 2 moments in Tagore's very complex life, or his very complex career. And one moment is when he went abroad in 1917. He gave lectures on nationalism in Japan and then in the United States. And these were later published by Macmillan. And in these lectures, he takes quite an unequivocal position against nationalism, okay? And he says, let me quote you, "Nationalism is a great menace. It is the particular thing which for years has been at the bottom of India's troubles. And in as much as we have been ruled and dominated by a nation that is strictly political in its attitude, we have tried to develop within ourselves, despite our inheritance from the past, a belief in our eventual political destiny." So this book is easily available. I invite you to read it. I'm sure most of you have read this book on nationalism by Tagore. But throughout these lectures, he uses very, very critical terminology in his discussion of nationalism. He calls it a machine. He calls it the engine of organization. He calls it predatory. He says it's in nationalism that clever lies become matters of self-congratulation. I'm quoting Tagore. "Solemn pledges become a farce," okay? And he goes on to say, I'll give you one more quote and then we discuss it a bit. "Have you not seen since the commencement of the existence of the nation that the dread of it has become the one goblin dread with which the whole world has been trembling? Wherever there is a dark corner, there is a suspicion of its secret malevolence, and people live in a perpetual distrust of its back where it has no eyes. Every sound of a footstep, every rustle of a movement in the neighborhood sends a thrill of terror all around." I hope we haven't come to that yet. This was certainly the case in Stalin's USSR, if you go by the records, but we'll come to that later. Now, you need to understand one, or we all need to understand one very important thing, which is that we have to ask this question: was Tagore an anti-nationalist? And a simplistic and reductive reading of this one text would certainly suggest so. But mostly on the strength of these lectures and a few other texts, he has been quoted and cited and understood as an anti-national, or an anti-nationalist, please. Let me correct myself. He was never an anti-national. He had wonderful essays where he talked about the Swadeshi Samaj, how to build Indian society, and so on. But now the question is, how do we read this text on nationalism? And E.P. Thompson, in his introduction, says that one quick way to understand it is that the nationalism here stands for imperialism. He's critiquing, and the chapters also go like that: nationalism in the West, nationalism in Japan, and everywhere he went, what he was really doing was critiquing Western imperialism and what the competition between these imperialist powers had resulted, which was World War I, you know. So we have to contextualize these lectures, and no, that doesn't mean, don't misunderstand what I'm saying, that doesn't mean that he was really a champion of Indian nationalism. No, he had very deep doubts when he participated in the Swadeshi Andolan, and he was deeply disillusioned because he felt that this machine, and he was deeply distrustful of ideologies also because he felt that they destroy the finer inner creativity of individuals, you know, and destroy relationships. And this is the second part of my discussion on Tagore, where, you know, to understand Tagore in a more complex way, we have to be diatopical. In other words, there's a wonderful essay on Tagore's nationalism and its antinomies by Savyatachi Bhattacharya and EPW. You can read it. And his strategy there is is to give you the phases of Tagore's career and how his ideas of nationalism changed over time. And he identifies at least 5 phases. He also tells us that we make the error of only reading his English writings and only this one book on nationalism, and we come up with a very reductive understanding. So the diatopical challenge in reading Tagore is not only diachronical, that is, you have to look at the evolution of his career over a period of time, but diatopical also in the sense that you've got to cross genres and languages, and sometimes, you have to look at his art as well, not just his writing. So it's a huge challenge if you want to get a more complex picture of Tagore's idea of nationalism. But let's move from these lectures on nationalism 1917 to some of his books, and almost there are at least, if not at least 3 major political novels that Tagore wrote, okay? Gora, then Ghore Baire, and then Char Adhyay, okay? And we'll look briefly at some of these texts, very briefly. What happens in... anyhow, so I just wanted to quote you the E.P. Thompson thing in the introduction. He says, for nationalism, we might often read imperialism. Anyhow, so let's, as I said, look very briefly at some of Tagore's literary texts, okay? Let's look at his what many consider his most significant novel, Gora, 1907-1908, written very soon after, the partition of Bengal, and it was serialized in a journal called Prabashi. Now, through his eponymous protagonist, Tagore rejects both the extremes of religious ultranationalism and comprador elitism. The first part of the book shows the inadequacy of the former, while British imperialism comes under attack somewhat indirectly later. It is only when Gora goes to the countryside that he finds the brutal side of British rule. The oppression of the peasants and the economic pauperization of the villages opens his eyes to the structural realities of imperialism behind the rather polite facade of paternalistic collaboration offered to the native bourgeoisie. From being a good subject, Gora becomes a bad subject and, of course, finds himself in jail. When he returns, he's disgusted to discover he has become a national hero. The very middle class, which refuses to move a muscle to help the poor, has now transferred the guilt of its apathy into an adulation for him. Gora's long disappearance from the text serves to give the other characters the space to resolve their complicated personal and social relationships. Gora in turn discovers what has been his own fatal flaw. First, the neglect of and ignorance about the peasantry, but equally so, the suppression and disregard of the other half of India, its women. This is very apropos tomorrow's International Women's Day. It is now that Sucharita's face appears in his mind's eye, merging in a very interesting way later with that of his mother Anandamayi, who is of course a symbol of Mother India herself. He clearly understands that a new India can be created only by including and recognizing its women. This will have to be a collaborative and cooperative project, harnessing the energies and agencies of both the sexes. When you want me to finish, what happens in these texts and later in Ghore Baire is that the figures who represent the passion of politics and the passion even of nationalism and the passion actually of revolution are considered and seen to be extremely dubious characters, like Sandeep in Ghore Baire. And they come under a lot of criticism, and their politics destroys the lives of people, in the sense that Bimala is misled, her marriage is destroyed, later Amulya dies, and so actually the costs of this are so high that in a sense this sort of passionate politics even comes under a great deal of scrutiny, interrogation, criticism in Tagore's work. So much so that George Lukács, the famous critic, Marxist critic, who reviewed Ghore Baare, dismissed it as a trivial, sentimental novel worth nothing, and he said that. Look at this man, he's a reactionary, he's a petty bourgeois reactionary, Tagore, who, cannot give any narrative space to a voice that is embodying the aspirations of an enslaved people rebelling against imperialism. So, if I were to kind of sum up, I can read you this, an excerpt from Lukash's review, which was published in Die Rote Fahne in 1922, where, and actually he says that Sandeep is a caricature of Gandhi. Lukash is obviously mistaken. The novel was written before Tagore met Gandhi in 1915. So Lukash's critique has some factual errors. I was talking to you about the importance of factual errors. Anyhow, the author portrays, this is Lukács, the author portrays the beginnings of the national movement, the struggle to boycott British goods, to squeeze them out of the Indian market and to replace them with native products. The hypothesis is that India is an oppressed, enslaved country. Yet Mr. Tagore shows no interest in this question. Let the British come to terms as they wish and in their own way with the damage done to their souls through their use of violence. Mr. Tagore's task is to save the Indians spiritually and to protect their souls from the dangers posed by the violence, deceit, etc., with which they are waging their struggle for freedom. Lukács obviously has no patience for such spirituality. Thus, Tagore becomes the butt of his denunciation. He says, Lukács says of Tagore, this stand represents nothing less than the ideology of the external subjection of India. But Tagore's attitude is even more blatantly manifest in the manner in which he shapes this demand in the action and characters of the novel. The movement which he depicts is a romantic movement of intellectuals, romantic utopianism, ideological exaggeration, and the crusading spirit, which are essential parts of these movements. He turns this crusading romanticism, whose typical representatives were without question motivated by the purest idealism and self-sacrifice, into a life of adventure and crime. His hero, a minor Indian noble who advocates the current doctrine, is destroyed both inwardly and outwardly by the rapacious excess of such a patriotic criminal band. His home is destroyed. He himself falls in a battle that was sparked off by the unscrupulousness of the patriots. Okay? So, what's going on here is Lukács, and along with him a certain number of other critics, branding Tagore not so much as anti-national now, or anti-nationalist, but as anti-revolutionary. Now, I don't wish to take sides at all in this kind of critique of Tagore, because, as I said, that's not how I see my function. My function, as I see it, or actually my quest, is really to try to deeply understand things and not to come to very quick and reductive judgments, right? And we are still talking about the hermeneutics of mediality, the diatopical hermeneutics. How do we read figures like Tagore and Gandhi, who are so complex? And certainly, I hope that I've demonstrated to you, or at least placed before you for your consideration, the possibility that these figures are really very complex and do not easily lend themselves to a reductive and simplistic understanding. And this resistance to essentialism is not something that is unconscious, but it's actually a part of their own protein and creative, you might say, imperative, which is how they saw themselves. Now, we'll come to Gandhi, and I will be a bit faster on Gandhi. Again, I want to focus on two moments in Gandhi's life. It's also very interesting that Gandhi and Tagore not crossed, but were in London at the same time, but they never met because they didn't know each other. This was in 1890. Gandhi was in England from 1888 to 1891, and Tagore was there in 1890 when he was passing. I mean, he spent a few months in England, but obviously Gandhi was not known. He was certainly not a politically important figure. He was actually in his formative stage. But let me now shift to another moment in Gandhi's life. which was around 1909, when he was on a ship, SS Kildonan Castle, and on this ship, he was returning from South Africa, from England to South Africa, and on this ship he wrote a book called Hind Swaraj. He wrote it, of course, in Gujarati originally, but later in 1910 it was translated into English and published in his own journal called Indian Opinion in South Africa. Now, what happened to Gandhi there? If we don't know all the details, but Anthony Parel and others who have written about it, they said that when Gandhi was in England, he met every possible shade of Indian freedom fighter, revolutionary, and some of these meetings took place, and it's recorded that he did go to India House. India House was created by a man called Shyamji Krishna Varma, who was actually from a very humble family. He was an Arya Samaji, and he gave a platform to Indian revolutionaries, both of the left and right. This is also a very interesting conjuncture at that time in India's history. The divisions between the two sides were not as marked and antagonistic as we see today. For example, the founder of the Garar party, was a man called Lala Hardayal, who was also an Arya Samaji, and he wrote a very interesting book called Karl Marx the Rishi, you see, which we don't talk about these books, but these are some interesting things that we have to go back to in our history. But, and also, here's a very interesting thing, that it's believed that Gandhi met Savarkar at India House, who was also there, and he heard all these revolutions. For India was a non-violent revolution, because he believed that, now some people look at this strategically. He thought, they said, well, Gandhi was just a scheming banya, and basically he figured out that Indians had been completely disempowered, disarmed. They could never beat the British in their own game, which is through an armed struggle. This is how some people view it, and perhaps there is some truth in this idea that the British Empire was almost invincible in terms of its armed might. It was a police state, and if you look at the history of that period of India, and I'm not a historian, you've heard other historians before me, they were able to neutralize, transport, hang, silence every single opponent of the British Raj. Any important opponent. Tilak was sent off to Mandalay, Aurobindo was jailed in Alipur, other people were hanged, other people were sent off to Andamans, so Bose had to run away from India, and he came back with an army which was defeated in Kohima. So the British Raj was in some ways not defeated by the force of arms, but by the time they left, there was a secret note that was sent by the Viceroy to Churchill, who was the wartime Prime Minister, as you know. How long can we hold India? And the secret note said that we can hold India for possibly another 25 years, because we have the coercive apparatus to do so, but it's going to be increasingly difficult, because the Indians have lost their respect for and also fear of the British Raj. And this is what Gandhi did. He completely, in some ways, made Indians unafraid. And then when you have an unafraid populace, you can't control it, right? You know that very well. Thank you. Now, but the terminology that Gandhi uses and what he discovered is that bahubal, महज बाहुबल बल नहीं है, उसमें बुद्धि बल भी होता है, आत्म बल भी होता है. And he believed that इस देश में अगर कुछ चलेगा तो आत्म बल चलेगा. इससे जो गरीब है, जो पिछड़ा है, जो पिटा हुआ है, जो बिल्कुल उसमें कोई शक्ति नहीं है, वो भी खड़ा हो सकता है, क्योंकि आत्मबल सबके पास होता है. And he actually said that his method, which I'm coming to the second point, his method of satyagraha could be practiced by anybody. And in fact, he said that women are better. He said they are better able to do it, because of various reasons which many feminists wouldn't like, but his basic point was that they are quite, patriarchy keeps pushing them down, but they वो सह लेती हैं और अपना काम भी कर लेती हैं, जो करना होता है वो. So he said anybody can offer satyagraha. So आत्मबल सबसे बड़ा बल होता है. So these were the two discoveries of Gandhi. He said, first of all, that India should win its freedom through non-violent means, which was very suitable to the civilizational orientation of India. Now, I'm going to come to my second Gandhi moment where he contradicts this, where he witnesses the partition and the incredible violence. I'll come to that in a moment. But he admits, he says, nobody understood non-violence. For them, it was just passive resistance, just something convenient. Anyhow, so Gandhi talks about three things there, as I said. One is non-violent struggle for freedom, which he calls Swaraj. And I invite you to also ask yourself, you know, what is Swaraj and what is Azadi? Okay? We've had wonderful slogans here on Azadi. And we can talk about this later. The root of the word Azadi, where it comes from, it's a Persian word, and what it really implies. We'll talk about it if you're interested. But I can tell you a little bit about Swaraj. For Gandhi, Swaraj could only be possible through self-restraint, which is that Swaraj means that I, if I'm more powerful, do not use my power over you. Swaraj also means I resist those who want to control me. So Swaraj, for Gandhi, meant a very responsible, a very, should you say, Sanyam bhi Swaraj ka ek bahut bada hissa hai. And he wanted a certain kind of society for India, a society where everybody had a chance, where everyone was respected, everybody had dignity, right? And the state belonged to everyone. So this was the kind of consensus that I was talking about, the middle ground, or whatever you call it, the mediality, which sometimes gets lost in these battles that we are in the midst of. So Swaraj, how to get Swaraj? He didn't talk about political independence. He said, we want Swaraj. And Swaraj doesn't end with political independence. It's an ongoing struggle. It's a constant struggle. Because if someone else doesn't have Swaraj, what's the use of my Swaraj, you see? If someone else is suffering, what's the point of my being happy? You know, so it's a constant, there's no end to it. It's a perennial struggle. That's Swaraj for Gandhi. And what was the method to Swaraj? It was satyagraha, okay? So this insistence on truth, right? And we'll have to understand what that means. I think, in a way, I'll just pick up one phrase from what Professor Nair said. She said I think she said a passionate dispassion, you know? So, sorry? Passionate detachment, that's wonderful, wonderful. You know, I would like to define satyagraha as a kind of combination of dispassion and compassion. Because dispassion is required to understand things, you know. If you're already prejudiced, if you already have a conclusion in mind, you've already prejudged something, you'll never find out truth, satya, so to speak. So every scholar has to be, that's the scientific temper, that I have no personal stake in my inquiry. I want to just know what the things are like. So that's dispassion. But that's not enough, because if you just have dispassion, you're not going to be able to understand someone else's suffering. So you also need, with dispassion, compassion. So I think that that's what Gandhi meant partly by satyagraha. Of course, he made it an incredible political weapon which mobilized the masses. You know, millions and millions and millions of people joined the national movement, partly because he was able to galvanize them, right? Now, and of course, the third thing which we can just talk about is the idea of sarvodaya. So there is no possibility of Swaraj without sarvodaya. And he gave a talisman before he died. He said that, look, imagine the face of the least privileged, the most wretched person, and ask yourself if what you contemplate is what you're going to do. When your mind is confused, he said, when you don't know what to do, think about that person and ask whether your action is going to help that person or hurt that person. You know? So, in a way, no Swaraj is possible without Sarvodaya. So these are the three things of Gandhi. Now, I'll just come to the second Gandhi moment. You can just hold up that other book for a second. This is a book called The Death and Afterlife of Mahatma Gandhi, which came out last year, where one of the things I do in this book is look at Gandhi's last 133 days in Delhi. He comes here on the 9th of September after he's managed to broker an amazing peace in Kolkata. He was staying in Haidari Mansion. The city was in flames, and then there was some peace. Let him sit. Okay. Right. So he arrives in Delhi on the 9th of September. It's raining, and his normal place of residence, the sweepers' colony, is no longer available to him. and he is sent to Birla House. He says, "Why have you put me here?" And if you go to Birla House, you see the little room in which he lived with, sleeping on the floor. It was almost like telling the world, "I live here, but I'm not off this place." Anyhow, but now in these last 133 days of Gandhi in Delhi, one of the things he was trying to do was to save India from a perpetual, never-ending civil war. A partition which would keep on happening, constantly. I mean, there is a kind of mimetic violence that Girard and others have talked about, and Gandhi quickly saw that this retaliatory and mimetic violence had to end, and he was prepared to give his own life for it. He called it his last yagya, by the way. And he said, "Isme ahuti kya di jaye," and eventually he gave his own life as the ahuti, in this yagya. And indeed, there was a peace that was brokered, and some say that even to this day, there's been not a single communal incident in Delhi, in this area where, the city is full of saints and martyrs. Guru Tegh Bahadur and, so many others are buried here, including the many Sufi saints, especially of the Chishti Silsila. So there is a dialogue in this city, even a tension between two kinds of power, okay, which is temporal power and spiritual authority, let's say. And Gandhi was one of the few who could embody both without having either, because he had no political position, nor did he have any religious position at all. But in these last 133 days, what Gandhi did was constantly appeal all the people of India not to imitate so-called acts of violence, to restrain themselves, to believe in the rule of law. And though he thought that the state was a coercive, apparatus, he said at least the state should have the soul or the monopoly of violence, because if that is perhaps to keep law and order. Because some people said that, his acolyte, his disciple, Patel was very बहुत सख्त थे, तो उन्होंने ये कहा कि अगर we are not able to maintain law and order, people will lose faith in this new state, and there will be anarchy and retaliatory mob violence. But Gandhi was very sad and sorry in these last days because he felt that India's freedom would be lost. And if India would be lost, he felt it would be a blow to progressive forces, to nations all over the world, which were also on the brink of freedom. I want to read just one little excerpt from these last days of Gandhi, and then sort of come to the last part of my talk and try to end it. Now, if I can find it, but maybe I should have a sip of water. Just give me a second. Ship of state is like a leaking boat, and it's going to sink. And then he gives the metaphor of Gajendra Moksha, this crocodile which pulls down this elephant. And he says, ये इंडिया बर्बाद हो जाएगा अगर हम इस तरह की लड़ाई झगड़ा और ये हिंसा न छोड़ दें तो. And then he goes on a fast, before he's murdered, before he's assassinated. He actually went on a 5-day fast, and his doctor said, "This is going to kill you." But that didn't stop him. And it's only at the end of that fast that all the sections of Delhi, the warring factions, came and signed a pledge to end violence. And many of the Muslim citizens of Delhi who had left their homes in Chandni Chowk, Daryaganj, returned to their homes. There's a very nice account of these of what Gandhi achieved in a book by Gyan Pandey, where he quotes eyewitness accounts, people who were there, and he said, that this is what, all the citizens of Delhi, breathed a sigh of relief, and they returned to their homes. And in some ways, India was, within quotes, saved from a repetitive and continuous partition. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about Tagore, we've talked about Gandhi, and we've also seen the complexity of their positions and how Gandhi himself said that people of India haven't understood non-violence, and that when British authority was removed, look at how they are at each other's throats. And then he said that Even if other people retaliate, we shouldn't lose our humanity by going down to their level. This is what he says. It's not that, he's exonerating any community or any group of people. He's saying that, and you must see this, these last days of Gandhi are really, really very important, where he has to revise his positions from the, from the immediacy and ultimacy of non-violence. That was his position, to its ultimacy. But so far as its immediacy is concerned, he was willing to compromise and said, well, some form of conditional violence may sometimes be required just to protect people who are being attacked. So anyhow, so we have these two important figures in our history, Tagore and Gandhi, and the complexity of their views on nationalism. Now let's come to our present situation for a bit. Though so much has been said, so much ink has been spilled, thankfully not so much blood, but so much ink has been spilled. And to me, when I heard the title of this series, what the nation really needs to know, if I also asked, does that mean that we in JNU, as my friend Kanhaiya also said, हम उनको बताएंगे क्या है? क्या हमको सुनना भी नहीं है? हमको सिर्फ सबको बताना है? हमने सब कुछ समझ लिया है? हमको सुनना भी तो चाहिए वो लोग क्या कहते हैं, है ना? ये मुझे लगता है. So this is the diatopical intermediality I was telling you about. हम कुछ कहेंगे और कुछ सुनेंगे भी, है ना? और जब हम उनकी बातें सुनते हैं तो गलत फहमियां तो है, लेकिन ऐसे लगता है कि यहाँ से जो डिस्कोर्स निकलता है, जो चर्चा निकलती है, बातें, इट्स वेरी एंटी, सकारात्मक नहीं लगता. ऐसे मुझे लोगों ने कहा है, सोचने वाले भी, सब नकारात्मक ही है. And then the question arises, there are very important questions here that we should really consider, which is that somebody said here, लड़ेंगे, झगड़ेंगे, ये करेंगे, fellowship भी बढ़ाएंगे. Wonderful if you can accomplish it. But this is our own state. We have elected these people. Unless you say this bourgeois democracy, we don't believe in. And this is the rub. This is when I come to the last part of my talk. What is left? Left here has a double meaning, obviously. That is, what is left of the nation, मतलब क्या बचा है? जब हमने जो मिडिल ग्राउंड था उसको ही डिस्ट्रॉय कर दिया है, सिर्फ एक्सट्रीम्स बचे हैं, क्या बचा है देश का? But left of the nation means also what the leftists have been saying. My friend Kanhaiya said yesterday that हमारा सबसे पुराना संगठन है और हमने आजादी की बहुत लड़ाई करी है. But I want to ask him, what about the flip-flop that happened by the Communist Party of India when they suddenly declared that the imperialist war was a people's war? What happened to that? And I can quote, I have the text here. They said to the British, the Communist Party wrote a secret letter. They said, we will not agitate when you're fighting. We will cooperate with you. So when he said that we fought for India's independence, that is the left student associations, I want to know what the evidence is. It's very important to ask these questions. Similarly, if you allow me to speak, and I might ask my friend, Kanhaiya is right here. He said Golwalkar met Mussolini. Didn't you say that? Did you not say that? In your speech. But did you check your facts? It's Munje who met Mussolini, not even Hedgewar. I'm not saying that they were not impressed by the fascists. They were. They thought it's a very good idea to have an authoritarian system. So please, let's agree on what is factual and what's not factual. But we have to check our facts. That's my point. So fascism stands for a certain kind of anti-democratic position. But so does Stalinism. I'm proud to belong to a country where one so-called judicial murder created such a huge ruckus. Do you know how many judicial murders were committed from 1920 to 1950 in Stalinist USSR? Do you have any idea? 799,553. Almost 1 million. And how many people were executed for criminal and civil charges? Only 34,000. How many people went to the Gulag? 14 million. How many perished there? 1.4 million. Now, my submission is, and where am I getting these facts? From Soviet records. please look, please, iski bhi charcha honi chahiye. What I'm trying to say is fascists are anti-democratic, but we have to also look at the record of some of our friends from the left. They were very anti-democratic. Stalin certainly was. He killed everybody who disagreed with him. And he killed Trotsky as well. And this is not new in JNU. 1970s, you read the history of JNU, I think the author is somewhere here. I saw him earlier. There he is. There was a very interesting Trotskyite called Jairas Banaji. And he challenged, I mean, the most charismatic established left leader, who was none other than Comrade Prakash Karat. And in the following year, Anand Kumar defeated Karat in the JNU poll as a free thinker. So we have to look at our own history and see what has happened. So please let's examine these details and see who tolerates democracy, who tolerates dissent, who doesn't. Now, we've had so many statements from everywhere. Can you show me a statement from North Korea over there? Or even from China? Because in China, even today, I've been to China 5 times, and it's ruled by the Communist Party of India, but it's a capitalist state, as you know. But you know, I've met many Chinese intellectuals in a cafe over a drink. They can tell you whatever you like. They'll tell you how bad certain things were. But ask them to take out a morcha, they can't. You go to Tiananmen Square and take out one poster. See what happens. You'll be whisked away. Where? Who knows? So who's democratic, who's not democratic is something we have to deeply, deeply ask ourselves. Allow me just 2 more things. I gave you a very important instance of what happened during the independence movement. 2 more instances, and then मैं खत्म करता हूँ अपनी बात, and you can ask me questions. The second time, so India became independent in 47, and the Communist Party of India, which was then not divided, was led by a man called Ranadive, and he gave a slogan, "Ye Azadi Jhoothi hai." Romesh Thapar, who edited a journal called Crossroads, was trying to smuggle because he was taking them to Telangana, and Nehru evoked sedition. He also evoked sedition against organizer. Let me tell you, dono side, Nehru said, boss, ye kya ho raha hai? Dono side keh rahe the in different ways, they were attacking independence. So ye azadi jhoothi hai, these slogans have persisted over time. So the communist line on India's independence followed Stalin, where he said revolution in the colonies would be a 2-step process. In the first step, you would have a bourgeois kind of revolution or a bourgeois takeover of power, and the second step you would have a truly communist government in place. So this 2-step theory was followed even in India. Another moment when China invaded India, EMS Nambudripad sided and said India is the aggressor. So the only thing I'm trying to say is that why is it so difficult to accept the legitimacy of the Indian state for many people in both the established left? Forget about the Maoists. The Maoists in India believe in armed revolution to dislodge this government, take over power. And you know that DSU is an offshoot of this Maoist party. And let me also tell you, please look at the letter of resignation that Umar Khalid Anirban wrote from Dusu. You know what they said? We are resigning because there's no scope for dissent. There's no democracy in Dusu. Look at the ironies of these situations, okay? I just want you to be alive to them, please. So that was another moment. And the third moment, if you want to look at it, is what happens after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you look at the New Left Review issues, and it's a great crisis. What to do? Because the only counter to imperialism, the only counter to capitalism is now gone. And they said, well, within the state, within the bourgeois state, be a critic, which I accept. But the point I'm trying to make is that different shades of the left in India have had a great deal of trouble in accepting the legitimacy of the elected government of India, whoever the party is. Now, the real question is this: from where does the left, let's say, forget the left, but certain kinds of left, because there are all kinds of left. There was a Congress left called the Socialist,
Aruna Asaf Ali, Achyut Patwardhan, JP, these were branded by the Communist Party of India. Look at the dialogue. There's a progressive left. There were writers like Mulk Raj Anand, they were thrown out. Manto was thrown out for indecency. So it's a complicated story. I don't want to simplify it. But the one thing I want to ask you is this. When you say that we will overthrow the elected government, where do you derive your legitimacy from? Is it that all the peasants have been polled to give you the legitimacy? I submit for your consideration that the legitimacy, what authorizes violence in this case, and you know the summary execution of informants, please read what happens. If you're thought to be an informant, you're executed by these people. I can give you figures. Anyhow, where does it derive its authorization? Where does it derive its legitimacy? I submit to you, it derives its legitimacy and authorization from ideology. So it's like a theological authorization. It's not through any plebiscite or vote which says, yeah. So if people in JNU had voted, let's say the student union had organized an actual debate like was done in Oxford Union on the eve of the war, World War II, when they said this house believes that England, Britain should not join the war or something, and they voted and they won. That was not sedition. The point being that let's have a debate, let's see how many people on this campus support separatism in Kashmir. We could have a debate. Let's see how many, the 8,000 students in JNU, apparently, according to Professor Shupori's statement. If you go to the website, the latest, I'm so sorry. I apologize. Yeah. I'm getting carried away. I'm wandering about here and there. But the JNU website's figures are not updated. It's 2009 are the figures, and they sit at around 7,000 students. And you know that my friend here, whom I deeply respect, Kanhaiya Kumar, was elected by a little over 1,000 votes, right? And the second person got 600 and some odd votes. You can correct me as to the actual figures, but shouldn't we have a real debate? And you'll find, my suspicion is I live on this campus, I've been here for 16 years. Exactly, that's right, but let's poll, I agree, but let's poll. Let's poll how many students support Kashmiri separatism, and then, no, not now. Let's have a proper, thank you. But you'll see, with due respect to you, you're far outnumbered. 5 people raised their hands, but even so, anyhow, please, let's get back to the point. Even so, I'm saying that that's another way to do it. That's my point. And then there would be a legitimacy to this kind of movement. And why not? I mean, every form of opinion should be respected. I don't think that is the issue. My question was that when something is authorized, what is it that authorizes it? And to me, social contract, call it Locke, call it Rousseau, is the basis of modern democracy, where people and their rulers have a contract that we vote you and you represent our will. Okay, anyhow, now I'll just come to the end of my talk, which was simply that when we consider ourselves to be a democratic space, we should also ask ourselves if this is entirely true. Isn't it possible that this is a left hegemonic space where if you disagree, you're silenced, you're boycotted, you're browbeaten, right? Or sometimes you're brainwashed. I can give you so many examples, but let me just say one thing. I love JNU too. I love JNU as much as anybody else. Love is very important. 2 minutes, finish. 2 minutes. I agree. He's told me the right thing. He says, you're a speaker, don't go into one-to-one. I absolutely respect. I'll finish in 2 minutes. But what makes us special, I think, is we don't beat the people we disagree with. We can bully them, but we don't beat them. I haven't been beaten here as yet. But exactly, where the other people said there's a reward and all. But I stand in solidarity of all those who want to protect the autonomy, not only of JNU, but of all educational institutions. I stand in solidarity of those who who demand due process, who believe in the institutions, not just of a university, but of a country. All democratic institutions. I stand by all this. But the only thing I'm trying to submit to you is that even I have been a victim of a campaign of vilification. Let me tell you, there's been open letters against me, and somebody circulating something today. I don't know what it is. I've never signed a Hindi petition abhi tak. ये पूरा हिंदी में उसमें मेरा नाम भी जोड़ दिया, पता नहीं क्या मैंने पढ़ा नहीं है. But the only thing I wanted to say to you is this. Look, after these things happened, this is my last point. You know, I was walking to the department and I saw this person with a placard, you know, on a bicycle. I'm not anti-national, right? And I think we are not anti-national, I agree. And when you hear my views, some of these views which are critical of what I consider left hegemonic practices, sometimes bordering on left dictatorial practices, all right? I hope I don't have to carry a sign saying I'm not anti-JNU, okay? I'm like all of you. I mean, and if you read any book of mine, I acknowledge JNU, I acknowledge my colleagues, I acknowledge my students. And I stand here before you because I believe that this performative is also important, where we discuss ideas, we uphold the right of each other to disagree, and we don't reduce all politics to sloganeering and self-complacency, but interrogate our own positions. And this is what I mean by the ditopical hermeneutics, where we are able to acknowledge the incompleteness of our own positions and go forward. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.